this particular psalm has particular significance to me as a psalm of joy. When I was in rabbinical school, we each had to pick one line that was for us the most important line, and it was made into kind of a page of Talmud. And I picked Psalm 100, verse 2. Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha, serve Adonai with joy, bo'u lefanav bernana, come before God with joyful song, as aspiration of what a religious experience, a religious life should be, or a happy marriage should be in this case as well. And when we at CBI were in transition, our arc, not because of me, but already had on it that verse, Yivdu et Hashem b'simcha. So it felt like CBI was the right place for me. And later, when I was partnering with what to engrave in the synagogue on the Eastern Wall, this was one of the two verses that we composed. So Psalm 100, verse 2, Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha, sing, serve God with joy, bo lefanav bernana, come before God with rejoicing, a important line of our sacred text. And again, Linda, for all you do for me and our family, not that we come before you with rejoicing. This word, to serve, let me pause. Actually, it begins with, this is a psalm of todah, of gratitude. So a word about the context for this psalm is understood. Rashi, the great commentator, 1040 to 1105 France, will say, this was the psalm they sang at the temple when they brought thanksgiving offerings. And even before Rashi, in Leviticus Rabbah, there's a statement about todah as a kind of offering. And it says that in the time of the Messiah, there will be no more sin, no more temptations. Therefore, no need for sin offerings. The only kind of offering that will continue even in the Messianic era is the Zevach HaTodah, the offering of gratitude. That's Leviticus Rabbah 9:7. And so this psalm was identified with that distinctive psalm of gratitude and thanksgiving, and was included in our daily prayers. The important early medieval writer Abu Daraham, who wrote about the prayers, he said this should be recited every day, and when we say it, we should say it the way they presented the Todah, the thanksgiving offering, meaning standing. So distinctly, this is a psalm said every day, said standing. You'll see it's only 5 lines, but as there was no thanksgiving offering, because it was an independent, free-willed offering on Shabbat or holidays, Psalm 100 is not said on Shabbat or holidays. Even though it's such an important psalm, it's said every other day and said standing. And so, Mizmor LeTodah, Psalm 100, a psalm of thanksgiving. With that, let me post the psalm and let's read it together, and then we'll analyze its construction and some of the beautiful things said homiletically as well about it. Serve Adonai with joy, Psalm 100. In the Christian tradition, at least in the American traditions, is also called the Old 100, and is also a popular psalm of celebration. A psalm of gratitude. Shout out to Adonai, all the earth. Serve Adonai with joy. Come before God with joyful song. Know, for it is Adonai who is God. God made us, and to God are we, God's people, flock of God's pasture. Come to God's gates with gratitude, God's courtyards with praise. Thank God. Bless God's name. For good is Adonai. Forever is God's kindness, and until generation upon generation is God's faithfulness. So there's a shift in this psalm. It's in the plural first person. In that sense, there's a quality of intimacy, but it shifts from the universal God, as if all the earth should shout out to Adonai in verse 1, to coming into God's gates with verse 4, or even being a flock to God's pasture. That third middle verse can swing both ways. You can read it universally, or you can read it as only of the people of Israel. But clearly, verse 4, speaking of God's gates and God's courtyards, is the move to God's temple. So this is a psalm identified with rejoicing in God's temple. This psalm, Psalm 100, is of particular importance to the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, 1700 to 1760. For the Baal Shem Tov, the move to his folk mysticism was a move from the mind to the heart, the emphasis on prayer and joy. And as his statement of rejoicing, it was Psalm 2. And so this psalm in particular for the Hasidic community was of central importance. And yet, there is this other line in Psalms, Ivdu et Hashem b'yira, Psalm 2, verse 11. Serve God with fear, or if you will, with awe. And so, for the Baal Shem Tov, it's natural, as in my assignment with my graduating class, to cherry pick, to pick out your favorite verse. For the Baal Shem Tov, this line, verse 2, defined his understanding of service of God, which is to be done with joy. And yet we have the contradictory statement, Ivdu et Adonai, same beginning, but instead of with simcha, it's biyira, with fear. And so already in the Midrash Tanhuma, early Middle Ages, they had to grapple with what's the reason for these two contradictory statements. And there, again, it's not clear when Midrash Tanhuma, figure 8th century, it said, well, some people are motivated by fear. They are like servants. And there, frankly, I'm hesitating because, again, it was in a different time and place. They said that's them, the non-Jews. But we Jews were motivated by ahava. We're motivated by love. Other commentators would basically point out this distinction, not necessarily between non-Jews and Jews, but say, for us, we need to be in service of God and out of love, as it says in Pirkei Avot, serve God with love and not out of fear. Later, because I'm going to tell a couple Hasidic stories, because this is such an important Hasidic psalm. There's that famous story many of you know of Rabbi Simcha of Bunim, mid-19th century, who said, we have two pieces of paper we're always to carry in our respective pockets. And one is when we're feeling down, we are to say, pull out the piece of paper that says, Bishvil li nivra ha'olam, for me the world was created. And when we're feeling inebriated with life, we're a little bit too high, we're to reach into our other pocket and say, afar le'efer, I am but from dust and ashes. And so that this tension of verse 2, serve Adonai with joy, and Ivdu Adonai b'yira, serve God with fear, becomes the yin yang, if you will, to use another traditional image of what it means to be in relationship with God, which leads to another Hasidic story. Namely, the beginning of this is the beginning of acknowledging a universal God. Shout out to Adonai, all the earth. Not only people, but all of creation. Serve Adonai with joy. Come before God with joyful song. And yet by verse 4, we're clearly coming into God's sanctuary. Robert Alter will make a comment in regard to verse 4. Come to God's gates with gratitude. And he'll say gates is the transition point where you're leaving behind the non-holy, entering into the holy. There's this liminal moment. So it's a two-step. Come to the gates with gratitude, and then God's courtyards with praise. And here, before I get to the Hasidic story, a distinction that my teacher, Peter Pizzoli, shared. The distinction between gratitude and praise. Gratitude, he said in a conversation, is saying what we acknowledge God has done for us personally. That's what we're grateful for. Praise is extolling God without any sense of the me. It's the sense of, wow, what a world you have created. And so, if you will, with that distinction, in verse 4, we come to the gates with gratitude. We are only naturally most motivated with a sense of what God has done for us. But once we are in God's presence, it's not about us. Then it's praise. It's the wow of the world that God has given us with the sense of egolessness. So in God's courtyards, now in that sacred space with praise, and hodu, here I do translate as thank God. I'm actually going to edit this to say praise God, bless God's name. Lahodot can be either, in Hebrew, praise or gratitude, and no doubt there's a lot of overlap. But the word tehillah is usually praise, and that's like tehillim, psalms. Psalms are spoken to God. And so here's the next two other Hasidic teachings. And that is the man who comes to the rabbi and he says, Rabbi, if God is everywhere, and I could therefore pray to God anywhere, why do you, in our tradition, seek for me to come to synagogue in order to pray? And the rabbi said, God is everywhere. God is the same everywhere, but we are not. And when we pray in community, we are changed. We are prompted to acknowledge God's presence. And so, again, that transition of acknowledging in the beginning here of God is the God of all the earth, and yet this is specifically a psalm of praising God in God's courtyards, in God's sacred space. So that's a Hasidic teaching. God may be the same everywhere, but we are not. And one more, and that's the teaching that I shared in my letter from a great Hasidic rabbi, my teacher and friend, Rabbi Abraham Twersky, who was also a psychiatrist who dedicated his career to first alcoholism, and later it grew to be addiction more generally. And he said to me when he first met me, I said, it's unusual for somebody who's a chassid, who's ultra-Orthodox, to be spending time with somebody who's a conservative rabbi. And he said to me, I'm very shaped by AA. And in AA, I'm Abe and you're Ellie. There are no titles. Well, by extension, there is, of course, the AA Serenity Prayer, composed by Reinhold Niebuhr, who lived 1892 to 1971. He taught across the street from the Jewish Theological Seminary. He taught at the Union Theological Seminary. And he has that famous line, the Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change, courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And my teacher, Rabbi Twersky, found that in verses 2 to 3. So 2, serve Adonai with joy, come before God with joyful song. And then he writes in one of his popular books called Living Each Day, even the book is AA based, having every day a reflection. And if you don't know this book, Living Each Day, it's worth having. 2 short teachings, a paragraph long for each day. And here he says, what does it mean when it says know for Adonai hu Elohim? God is God. Adonai who is God. What does that mean? So he says that the awareness that God is God, by extension, is to convey we are not God. And the ability to distinguish between what we can change, what we can control, and what we cannot control is an essential ingredient to happiness. In that paragraph, he writes, again in his work, of how many people are miserable because they feel either guilty over what they can't change or they feel frustrated. And he says to know the distinction, and again, I think he doesn't write this in that paragraph, but clearly the Serenity Prayer is what he is referencing, and that the link between 2 and 3 is know, for it is Adonai who is God. Now, of course, I'll stop with that's the self-contained teaching of Rabbi Twersky, but back to its own context of this psalm. 2 tells us serve Adonai with joy, come before God with joyful song, and then 4 picks up on 2. Come to God's gates with gratitude, God's courtyards with praise. So 3, if you will, is a module. It's really about knowing. It's the sandwich between 2 and 4, that in order to serve God with joy, to come to God's gates with gratitude and praise, one has to have, if you will, a mindset to know why we're praising God. And in verse 3, the explanation is, we are to know that it is God who made us, and that we are to God, God's people, God's flock. And so here in verse 3, you'll see parentheses, and that's what's called, what's written but without vowels, which is the third word in the middle of verse 3. Velo means not. So if that's called the ketiv, the way it was written, and kri, meaning how it's read, is in parentheses, because that's not how it was originally written. Now, who decided how it was originally written? There were scribe scholars called the Masoretes from about the 6th century to the 10th century who punctuated Tanakh. They gave vowels. They're the ones who put in the musical notations. And in some cases, they decided, well, this is an oral tradition, and the word lo can be spelled 2 different ways, but has 2 different meanings. Lo with an aleph means not. Lo with a vav means to him. And so here's the 2 ways this can be understood. It can be understood, know for it is Adonai who is God. velo anachnu, and not us, his people, which is more explicit. We are not God. Or if you will, we did not make ourselves. It was God who made us. But the Cree, the way the Masoretes chose to punctuate and change a letter, is the way it's translated here. God made us, that's the first part, and to God are we, his people, flock of God's pasture. So the most famous of the Masoretes was a family called the Ben Asher family. They lived in Tiberias. The last of the clan, Aaron ben Moshe ben Asher, he died in the year 960. And there would later be a debate because, in the Jewish community, there's more than one people that has this portfolio. There was the Ben Asher clan, and then there was another clan called the Ben Naphtali clan, who had 875 differences in how they notated over the Ben Asher clan. But Maimonides would nod out his approval of Ben Asher and say that his own writing of the Torah, which he did, he used the Ben Asher family. That's for the 5 books. Interestingly, Sadia, who lived in Baghdad and was a very important teacher before Maimonides, Sadia Gaon, he preferred the Ben Naphtali notations, but ultimately the Ben Asher would be received as the most authoritative. So that too is a whole story to pull together velo and velo. And this, we've seen this before in Psalms, but a discrepancy based on the Masoretes' writings of whether, and we are not the ones who created ourselves, or rather, and to him are we, his people. In this psalm, there's a sense of movement. There are 7 active verbs. Here they are, beginning with verse 2. Ivdu, serve, bo'u, come. Hariu, I forgot, verse 1, hariu, shout out. 2, serve, come. Verse 3, the 4th one, know. And then in verse 4, praise and bless. Now, the fact that there are 7 active verbs is, as we've seen, probably not coincidental. The poet here is conveying a trajectory. Shout out, serve, know, come, praise, bless, and 7 equals wholeness. This is very purposefully composed as movement forward, but sometimes you can read things in as well. So here's a good example of how I would believe, read in. Bo'u sharav b'todah chatzerotah, verse 4 in Hebrew, which translates as, come to God's gates with gratitude. If you take the first letter of those first words, as did a commentator in the 18th century called Chazat Zion, it spells out b'shevach, which means with praise. And so he reads these 4 words as an acronym. Sometimes you may be, if you will, creative reading and reading in. Couple last things and then I'll pull this together. And that is, a lot of the lines in this psalm are found somewhat earlier as well. So Psalm 95:1 is pretty similar in mood to this psalm. And you get Naria L'Tzur Yeshenu. That's the first of the Kabbalat Shabbat Psalms, Psalm 95, which here, Hari'u, let us shout out to God. You get that same thing in 95:1. You get in 95:2, Bo Lefanav Birnana. You have 95:7 in verse 4, very similar. And in verse 5, Ki tov Adonai le'olam chazdo, Psalm 106:1, the same words. So Psalms, as we're also seeing, are not necessarily distinctive in terms of words or phrases. They're collages. But how the collage gets composed with verses that, if you will, were well known within the community of service and praise, in each psalm at the same time is uniquely composed, purposefully composed, with those 7 active verbs, for instance. And so, this psalm, to pull it together, for many of the medieval commentators like Radak, to 19th century Frankfurt, Germany, Samson Raphael Hirsch, identify this psalm as messianic. It's the psalm that will be sung in the time of the Messiah, when only the Todah offering will be brought. This will be not only, the rabbis will say in Vayikra Rabbah, not only in the Messianic era will the Todah offering be the only one brought, but only Todah prayers will be recited. And so there is, for some, this messianic. By the way, in the Talmud, in Chod 54b, the Todah offering is identified specifically. When did people bring it? When they came through danger, then they brought it. And it was brought in a particular way. It was brought as an offering, free-willed. It was a chosen offering, voluntary. Part of it was given to the priest as a gift. Part was taken by the offerer, but had to be eaten quickly, within a day. And some emphasize that the nature of the Todah offering was one, first of all, of partnership between an individual and community, between the individual and the priest. And in that sense, it was a celebratory meal, a barbecued, sanctified meal that you would then be having. And because you had to eat it quickly, it meant 2 things. You needed to get other people to share it with you, so as not to make it go to waste. And because it was a Thanksgiving offering, you had to then explain, you had a context to say why you wanted them to come to your party, what it was that you were grateful for. And so to pull Psalm 100 together, and my honoring of my wife Linda on this occasion, it is Psalm 100, a prompt that was seen by our rabbis to be a prompt both of gratitude and of praise, to be done in the sanctuary, but even beyond the sanctuary. And more, for our tradition, it was aspirational, be it messianic or in Hasidic terms, the nature or the aspiration of how to live life, which is to live it with gratitude. And out of that gratitude comes humility, and out of that humility and gratitude comes rejoicing. Of letting go of self, you become more fully yourself. And in honoring an anniversary, letting go of self to become more fully oneself, to know in our tradition that 1 + 1 = 1, quote again Rabbi Twersky, is to say that one, in letting go of oneself, on some level becomes more whole, more fully oneself, and likewise in service of God. That the statement was made regarding the velo and lo by the Gera Rebbe, that the more we let go of ourselves, velo, the more we negate ourselves, the more we become lo, dedicated to God. And so, with that, Psalm 100, much to rejoice. It's nice to see all the screens and to take 10 minutes for some of your reactions to Psalm 100. Any comments? Can or Shula? Gotta unmute.
Well, when I was reading it last night, I had the exact same thought that you mentioned earlier, and that is that we've heard it as beyir'ah in a previous psalm, right? Ivdu et Hashem beyir'ah. But then I remembered the following fact. I never attributed the word yir'ah when connected to God as fear. I think the word that most connotes fear is pachad, and that's not here. Yir'ah has in it the same letters as seeing, to see, to understand. Yir'ah, it's the future, almost the future tense of seeing. So I think both in the previous psalm, as well as here without using that word, we are told that we can and should worship God by seeing and understanding God, which in itself gives us the joy to understand that God is our shepherd, God is faithful, God is all that. So I think when connected to God, yir'ah is never fear, it is always simcha.
So let me respond. And always, I value so much Cantor Shula's insights. And that is, there are many words in Hebrew, often synonyms, sometimes maybe not. And for the word fear, pachad, and yira is often translated as fear. I usually translate it as awe, because that's another quality of yira. Shula emphasizes that yira has the same root as to see, and that yira is the ability to see, which leads to awe before God. The only thing I would add linguistically is that awe is the beginning of two related words, awesome and awful. And we find that in English, and clearly how it's used in Hebrew, the word yira, can either emphasize the awesome dimension of God or the awful. Now, awful doesn't mean to be, means to sense that God has powers that are fearsome, like death itself. And so therefore, before God, who is eternal, we who are transient are aware of our creatureliness. So to pull this together, I love, and it's the first time I've thought of it the way you've described it, Shula, in terms of seeing and yira, and how we respond to what we see when we look at God, at least in traditional readings, is varied. And we live in a time where I too choose to translate yira usually as awe. Other reactions to Psalm 100.
A peripheral comment, you mentioned 7 being completeness. Newton
Yeah.
was very sensitive to that. That's why he added indigo to the color spectrum. His first was only six colors. He added indigo because he felt has to be 7. So he poked indigo in there.
You know, it's interesting, in this book by the former Librarian of Congress, his name will come to me, he writes about, say it again?
Borstein?
No.
No.
It's with a V, I think. But he has this book like The Discoverers, The Inventors, and he writes about how we got the 7 days of creation. I mean, how we got the calendar, the 7 days, to be a week. And he says the 7 days of a week, because normally you would think of 10. You know, we do most things as 10 because we have 10 fingers, decimal. And he says it's because of the power of the Bible story. That so widely accepted was the Bible story already before the Gregorian calendar and the Julian calendar before it, that it was only natural to create 7 days of the week. And so 7, very early imprinted, it's the power of the Bible equals wholeness. But I love that story, Chuck, and thank you for adding another dimension of how 7 then became the mindset to convey completion, or even to believe that that's how God would, in any dimension, create wholeness, is with sevens. Richard, did you unmute to share something?
Oh, anything that I have here is kind of parallels what you were saying. When I was reviewing the psalm, the words that came out were gratitude, serve, know, come, for good. That flow of thought and action of the psalm came out of gratitude, l'todah, that. And the idea of serve and know reminded me of the incident, or the time when the Exodus generation accepted the covenant at Sinai. That concept of serving and knowing, then following along with that. But
so
those are just, go ahead.
No, so that is our Torah reading of last week, that after and only after Mount Sinai do the people, and it's not only having been liberated, but it's after only hearing the law that the people will say, Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do and we will hear. And so that coupling, and the rabbis will emphasize that you do even before you hear, because you've heard enough to say, I do. So back to marriage, when you get married, you don't know everything yet about who this other person is, largely because you don't know who you are yet, and largely because you're always changing. But the concept of marriage is na'aseh v'nishma. I'll make the commitment and figure it out later, or it will evolve later. And so for the rabbis, at least in terms of the Torah, Richard's point, the quality of saying to God and of God, na'aseh v'nishma, emerges from the, I think it's 24/7. Yeah, verse Exodus 24/7, na'aseh v'nishma, is after not only having experienced God as liberator, but God as lover, who conveys guidance. And that's when you get the final confirmation of the covenant. And with that, a closing comment, and then we'll segue to Kaddish. And that is, the last line has the first word ki, which means for or because. And so it explains why we are so grateful to God. For good is Adonai. That notion that God is good. You know, I go back to my teaching of Rabbi Simon Greenberg, my teacher, and I've shared this with us before, who said in creation, it doesn't say that God declared the world to be perfect. God declared the world to be good. And that the greatest religious challenge is looking at the world and seeing the world through God's eyes, declaring that it is good. And ki tov Adonai, for good is Adonai. And to be in a mindset of seeing the good around us, as back to that creation story in Rabbi Simon Greenberg, he said, if you pick up the newspaper, it doesn't read so good. But you got to get a larger context for the world in which you live in order to have a religious, godlike mindset. And so that's the mindset here. Ki tov Adonai, for good is God. And then we acknowledge, Leolam chasdo vador vador monoto, forever is God's kindness, and until generation upon generation is God's faithfulness. And that last word of faithfulness, what is faith? It's being faithful. That's my teaching of Rabbi Brad Artson. What does faith mean? It means being faithful to the experiences of God that keep that in mind as your loyalty and duty. And so again, to pull together my honoring of my wife, Linda, what the last word here is being faithful. And clearly that's the cornerstone of all relationship, is the commitment that leads to being trustworthy, that allows for rejoicing. So happy 34th to my wife, Linda. And I invite those who are saying Kaddish, including my wife Linda for her mother Sylvia, who I bring to mind as well. If there are others who are honoring a yurtzeit or are in mourning, I invite you to join together. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah
Amen.
v'alma divra kirute v'yamlich malchute b'chayechon u'v'yomechon u'v'chayei d'chol beit Yisrael ba'agala u'v'zman kari v'imru amen.
Amen.
Yehei shmei Rabba mevarach le'olam omed maya Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitba'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei dekudsha berichu
Richu.
le'ela mincha kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechamata damiran v'alma v'imru amen.
Amen.
Yehei Shlama Rabba min Shemaya V'chayim Aleinu V'Kol Yisrael V'imru Amen.
Amen.
Osei Shalom V'Rumav U'Ya'aseh Shalom Aleinu V'Kol Yisrael V'Kol Yoshvei Tevel V'imru Amen.
Amen.
A closing comment as a segue to tomorrow, and that is Leonard Bernstein composed a 3-movement choral composition for Psalms called the Chichester Psalms. It's 3 movements of choral music. And the first movement of the Chichester Psalms is Psalm 100, mostly, with some Psalm 108. I'll add David Lang, I hope I get this right, at Tanglewood in Western Massachusetts one summer was Leonard Bernstein's assistant. And he, David Lang, is one of the other gifts my wife gave me in that he is Linda's first cousin. David at this point has already been the composer in residence for Carnegie Hall, a Grammy Award winning choral composer who was commissioned to write Psalm 101, which was what we'll study tomorrow, for Lincoln Center. So he's a major player in the world of classical music today, and you won't know it by, I don't think David's on today. Some days David's on. I don't want to embarrass him. I don't see David today. And David is just great company. You will, very modest and very productive. When he was asked, I heard him once interviewed at the Walt Disney Hall in downtown LA. One of his pieces was being performed, so Linda and I went, and he was interviewed before the concert, and he was asked why he was so productive. He's written operas for the Santa Fe Opera Company and many other pieces of opera and film scores that have been nominated for an Academy Award. Anyway, I can say all this stuff because he's not listening, so it's not to embarrass him. So the interviewer said to him, "You're so prolific. How do you get so much done?" And he said, "Well, I've learned from watching waiters and waitresses in restaurants. No matter which direction they're going to or from the kitchen, they're carrying something." So when I was speaking to David yesterday to prepare for tomorrow, I said, "David, that really stuck for me. I don't know if it made me more productive, but I often pick up an extra dish when I'm carrying something from the table to the sink, because I hear you saying you should always be carrying more as a waiter or a waitress." So anyway, David is memorable and lovely. 12:30 tomorrow. We're doing it with CSP so as to have a bigger Zoom opportunity. David wrote his own libretto for Psalm 101. And part of what we'll talk about is how and why he personalized what is a relatively short psalm. So I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Have a good day. To my wife, happy anniversary. Thank you.